exclusion, there are also mental spaces of exclusion. Some spaces are regulated through codes and signs, preventing us from entering. Some spaces through outright warning or more subtle deterrence. And these are photos we took when we were living in LA, some in Beverly Hills. These rich people, it's already a gated community. You need to actually have identity flags in order to drive inside. But even if you accidentally was able to go inside from here and there are signs saying like, warning, guard dogs, no trespassing, right? You will die when you go there. 4 holes. No trespassing, violators will be shot. This is from Texas, Austin. No trespassing, because violators will be shot, and survivors will be shot again. There is extreme harm telling you this is my space, don't come here. And this is usually a white middle-class community next to a community with a lot of people of color. You will see these kinds of warnings outside their homes. So it's really not, maybe not real, right? But mentally it makes you want to leave, right? It excludes you. So mental space may also be controlled through our fears and perceptions of activities and places. We may be hesitant to enter an expensive-looking shopping center if we do not have access to resources needed for the activities there, even though there may be not any physical barrier. Right? So mental space is a mental, emotional barrier. And in all these examples and arguments so far, what we see is a very clear relation between social exclusion and spatial exclusion. A combination of formalized rules and regulations, informal codes and signs, fears and desires control our spatial behavior and alert us to the limitations on our access. All these factors together affect how we feel, whether we feel included or excluded in the city. So social exclusion cannot be studied without looking at these spatial segregation and exclusion, as well as the cultural factors. So the exclusionary processes per se are not the source of social fragmentation and disintegration, but it is the absence of social integration, the reverse policies, which causes social exclusion, as individuals do not find the possibility and channels to participate in this society. So even if we have these exclusionary processes, if we have balancing opposite processes, there's still a certain way of integration. You can, for example, you have a policy in a city preventing property owners from using horrible signs like these, right? There's lots of ways to balance this out, right? And to control the excess of social exclusion. Now, the opposite of the idea of exclusion is the sense of community, the sense of neighborhood. And in Hong Kong nowadays, it's very hard to tell whether we have a community or whether we just have a housing estate, a real estate. So there are two kinds of approaches and mentality in using the same space. You can be a resident, a guy farm, or you can be a person who reforms the social exclusion in a city. And for people like that, you tend to emphasize the use value of the community, the use value of the neighborhood, the use value of the space. So neighborhoods is always seen as a site and physical manifestation of close social relations that might overcome individualism and leads to social integration. But for those people who look at neighborhoods just as a real estate, just as properties, and just as investments, like the growth machine in Hong Kong, right? You look at a place only for its exchange value instead of its use value. So you think of spatial subdivision promoted by town planning that echoes social spatial segregation by market forces. And through this, space is produced, exchanged, used, and is cut up into each and every different property for exchange value. So it's the same place, but some people think of it as a neighborhood. Some people think of it as a property. control of the government. So even if the government finds this as undesirable, right, the government really cannot do anything about it. So the producers of space tend to build in large-scale housing estates, creating an urban fabric which is a collection of different subdivisions. The land and property markets have operated in this way to ensure the segregation of income groups and social classes. You are where you buy, and you are where you rent. Commodification of spaces has led to different patterns of access to space, and hence a differential spatial organization and timescape. Our cities are very, very clear about it. On one side of the street, you feel you can enter. On the other side of the street is already a different world. So the growth machine sees space as a commodity and tends to create social spatial segregation through differential access. People have different access, different degrees of access to this commodity. And a town planning and design tendency to regulate and rationalize space protection by imposing different orders. So you see the new design of the Kai Tak airport site, right, will be redesigned into a new enclave of the rich, commodified in a way that makes people feel that you need to be quite rich to really use the facilities and the space. And Tin Shui Wai, right, is designed as new ghettos for the poor, very, very obvious. That the town planning itself, the way space is commodified, really produced a very clear sense of segregation. And one obvious issue, of course, is the difference between public and private space. Sometimes it's not that clear. Sometimes public space will be managed in a way to make you feel that it's a private property, as you have already experienced. So private property and private space are often demarcated through a variety of objects and signs, like subtle variation of color and texture and light in the gated community over the Kowloon station near West Kowloon Cultural District. On the street, the private side of the street has one kind of surface, right? The public side has a different kind of surface. Subtle variation of color and texture, fences and high walls. So, although somewhere is a public space, but if the management wants to privatize it, if the government no longer takes care of the space and has given it to a private company, outsourced company to manage its space, they can create this kind of variation of color and texture. They can create fences and high walls to make you feel it is not a public space. So the exclusionary process is legitimized through public discourse, through also these customs and laws. Having a security guard there telling you, hey, you stop leaning on my tree, right? You stop leaning on the fences of our garden and so forth. A lot of these people are really giving you the mental sense of exclusion. It might not be true. And if you insist, they really have no law against you. Public space, a concept that we have been coming back to over and over and over again. Just to remind you of a few things of natures of public space that we have talked about many weeks ago. Public space is maintained. There are definitions of public space that make you able to tell whether a space really qualifies as a public space. In the tutorials, we have debated on whether somewhere is an open space or public space or not. Sometimes you can't tell. And the town planning department continues to increase the definition of open space and public space, right? From 3 to 14 now. So actually, these are a few questions you can ask yourself to determine whether the place you're studying really qualifies as a public space. So we're getting more and more theoretical about it here. Public space is maintained by public agencies. If it's not maintained by public agencies, like the government, right, it is not technically no longer very much a public space. And it is maintained for public interest. Right? The logic of the maintenance of the space, right, the goal behind the management has to be cater towards public interest. It has to be publicly managed, public agency managed. And the management philosophy should be to cater for public interest. And it has to be accessible to the entire public, or everyone. Right? If it is not like that,